Okay. Good morning, good morning. Just one moment here while I rearrange my screen for us all. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on ungrading for equity. My name is Judith Dutil. I am from the Online Learning Toolkit. The Online Learning Toolkit specializes in faculty development for online educators. We're dedicated to creating joyful professional development experiences. You can catch us in webinars like this. We also deliver campus workshops, create faculty development courses, facilitate course design groups, provide one-to-one course design support, and we host a wonderful online community of practice. And you can learn more about all of these offerings at our website, onlinelearningtoolkit.com. To highlight one of our offerings, registration's now open for Camp Operation Online Learning. This is a 6-week course design course and community. We work alongside you this summer to help you build your online courses. This offering is good for educators at every level of experience and technology fluency. And again, you can learn more about this offering at our website, and we hope to see you there. Before I introduce this morning's speaker, we have some housekeeping. We're using Zoom's webinar platform this morning, which is slightly different from the meetings platform. We are capped at 100 attendees. If you are unable to get into the platform, you may be watching the live stream of the event on YouTube. In Zoom, cameras and audio are disabled for attendees, but chat is open. So if you have questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A box, and Christine will take some questions at the end of her presentation. In YouTube, chat will be open, and Melissa Whaler, who is our co-founder for the Online Learning Toolkit, will be monitoring that space for questions. Now to introduce our speaker this morning. Christine Nowick has taught at 3 community colleges, a for-profit institution, and a private liberal arts college, while also holding administrative roles throughout the majority of her career. Currently the chair of English at HAC, Christine embraces the hybrid nature of the faculty administration life, while also sitting at the disciplinary crossroad of the humanities and social science. Her research interests include power, change, and thick intersectionalities. Christine is a colleague of mine. Students love her, and I think that you will too. I will now turn off sharing on my screen and hand things over to our speaker, Christine Nowick.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Great to see you. While I'm loading up the slides here, I wonder if you would like to take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat of whatever platform you're on, just where you're logged in from and what you teach. That would be great. I see Iowa and Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Massachusetts. Alaska. Thanks for joining us so early. Excellent. So glad to see you all. Thanks for joining us today. The slides are loading up for us here. I'll use my floating head so that I can keep an eye on the chat. I treat presentations in Zoom like a podcast, so I don't assume that you are looking at the screen. You could be multitasking, doing 16 other things at once, especially for many of us who are still working from home and trying to juggle the demands of pandemic life and our responsibilities to our institutions and to our students. So I will be reading more from the slides than I typically would in a presentation. So I appreciate your patience, especially for those who cannot sit in front of a screen for a long time, and for the multitaskers among us. So I will be verbalizing more of what appears on the slides than I might normally. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started with a couple of our objectives today. I'm hoping that I will orient you to the ungrading framework, one of many frameworks in ungrading, give you a brief overview of the research, to share my own ungrading approach, to talk a little bit about equity and ungrading, and to engage in some discussion about practical application. I invite you to use the chat throughout the presentation. I love back channel communication, so please, by all means, connect with one another, connect with me if you want to jump in for a question that I can't work into our conversation just yet. I will come back to it and make sure your questions are answered. So again, thanks for joining us today. You heard a little bit about my background already from Judith, but I want to point out a couple of other things. In addition to the institutions that I have served, I am simultaneously occupying various roles in higher education. I am a student myself, finally finishing up a PhD after 157 years, a process that started not quite back in the 1900s, but close enough. So I sit in the seat of a student. I'm the parent of a college student, and I have actually two college students living in this house here during the pandemic, attending two different institutions. So I get to see lots of insider information from the student undergraduate perspective. I am a faculty member, chair of my department, and I am an administrator. Someone asked how to use the floating head. When you're in Zoom and you share your slides, go to advanced and you'll get the option to load up your slides as your background. You heard Judith mention that I'm a disciplinary hybrid, so that's true. I teach writing. I'm in the chair of the English department, but my academic work has always split the divide between social science and the humanities. Although my degrees are in English, my terminal degree here is rooted in sociology. And I've been doing a lot of cool stuff before it was cool, right? So I was one of those people who was arguing for online pedagogy back at the turn of the century. I am someone who started using OER in 2005, and I've been using power aware pedagogy for a long time, but I've been very quiet about it. Right. And we'll talk a little more about part of my process here had to include embracing my identity as a radical. So I'll talk a little more about that. So I've seen some stuff. I've been around the block. And the reason I say this is that sometimes people think about ungrading and trusting students as a naive position to take, right? And I disagree with that idea that it is a naive position to take. Again, I have been around the block. I am not a spring chicken. So how do I come to this conversation? Well, I come to this conversation with the basic belief that I trust students, right? I generally believe that people legitimately want to learn, that our culture and systems have trained students to aspire to achieving invisible academic currency in the form of grades, and that outliers should not drive decisions. These are some of the fundamental beliefs that I have about my own praxis and about my own work in higher education. So I also need to share that I consider myself an expert teacher because I taught my kid to drive a stick shift in an hour. And if you've ever had to teach your own teen how to drive a vehicle, you know how complicated that process is. And so, point of pride, I taught him to not just drive a car, but to drive a stick in an hour. Now, granted, he already knew how to drive by that point because I taught him previously, but I did teach him how to drive a stick shift in an hour. So I think about the audience for this session, and I am hoping that the people who are here already have some orientation around things like power in higher education and positionality in higher education, and are questioning some of the things that we have done as a taken for granted reality, right? Or taken for granted set of activities, that you are somehow questioning those things. I assume that there are some choir members here who probably already use some kind of ungrading framework and just want to hear more about something else. I do not assume that people in the audience are wholly resistant to the idea of ungrading and are here just to approach the conversation so that they can dispute it or resist it. So I assume that we are on some continuum here in the ungrading conversation. I'm going to ask you to take a minute to think for yourself. Just thinking, why do we grade? What's the reason? When you formulated something for yourself, feel free to go ahead and start typing it into the chat. See some comments from people who say they still can't drive a stick shift. I invite you to the Christine Nowick School of Driving. I'm happy to help. To prove that we are teaching something, that's one reason we grade. To determine student learning, to provide feedback, to let students know that they've fulfilled the expectations of the assignment, to measure people's knowledge. Grades are a blunt instrument to communicate to student how they're doing, to measure learning, to show mastery of a concept because our institutions require it. So one of the things I'll underscore in this presentation is that I'm a little bit of a hypocrite, right? Because I talk about ungrading, but at the end of the day, I still have to submit a grade. I don't live in a system where students don't get grades at the end of their courses to prepare students for licensure. Yeah, we're operating in a system that in many cases has some kind of licensure at the end. So students can later get into other schools or jobs. Higher ed expects it from K to 12 to meet students' expectations. Yeah, all of these things. Absolutely. And when I thought about this myself, why we grade, the answer that I came up with was because grading is an effective, objective measure of learning that motivates students to achieve. Is it though? That was the next question I had. Is it those things? Does it do the job that we assume that it does? Well, let's go to the research. You will not be surprised to know that grading actually reduces students' interest in what they're learning. You wouldn't be surprised to know that research supports the idea that grades motivate students to find the easiest possible route to a reward. You would not be surprised to know that research supports the idea that grades limit students' thinking. And you would probably not be surprised to know that grades promote a cheating environment. And I have a whole other tear about proctoring, online proctoring in the Zoom environment and pandemic environment that I will spare you today. But these things are related. Cheating behaviors grow and thrive in the system, the conditions that have been set for them. So these things will not surprise you if you have been in the classroom for any period of time. Quotation here, it would not be surprising to most faculty members that rather than stimulating an interest in learning, grades primarily enhance students' motivation to avoid receiving bad grades. That is probably not a surprise to you. Which makes me wonder, why do we keep doing it? This has been an 8-year 80-year investigation, right? 80 years of research around grading. Why do we keep doing it? Well, for a lot of the reasons you've already mentioned, right? But also for this reason, Lisa, people teach how they were taught. Yeah, that's true. We very often uncritically accept the experiences that we have had ourselves as the only way to do things, right? Absolutely. We have lived, we have grown up in this system, and we continue to perpetuate it. In some cases, unquestioningly, right? In some cases, uncritically. Any other thoughts? Yeah, ease. Higher ed is moving toward a for-profit model, and grading makes it easier to scale up. That's one of my primary arguments too, is that grading is easy, right? It's easy to say we're measuring learning using the mechanisms that we currently use. Demands for universities to rank students to show, quote, success. Absolutely. Absolutely. Higher ed lives in our culture, right? Is a product of our culture. And so we sort of perpetuate some of those things in the culture. It's baked into, Jen, that is one of my favorite phrases, baked into. It's baked into the structure of higher education. It's hard to change. We feel it's not fair to treat all levels of effort equally. Yeah, there's this element of fairness where we sort of conflate fairness and equity. These are all really great points. And where I finally came down on this in my own thinking is that our systems, as they are currently set up, are based on transaction largely, right? You do the thing, you get the grade. You pay the money, you get the credit. But such an approach disadvantages most students in their learning. That's what the research shows us. It disadvantages most students in their learning, with some students disadvantaged more than others. And for me as a writing teacher, I was really thinking through what I was actually measuring when I was grading writing, right? So there's sort of the myth of objectivity in higher education, that we're teaching to some standard in higher education. And for me as a writing teacher, it really caused me to stop and think, what is that standard? What is that academic language about? The target student, is it about the target student that we're teaching to, white male higher SES? I mean, think for a minute. Who was higher education built for and by and for what, right? For whom was higher education built? It's built for the target student, right? And those origins creep into and frame the work that we do today. Grading writing in particular. Now, I talk from my disciplinary perspective as a faculty member in writing, but know that although I'm talking about writing, smarter people than I are using ungrading across all sorts of disciplines and have written about it and have figured it out in ways that I cannot describe here, having not done it myself. But in writing, I was really thinking about the baked in, there's that language, Jen, unequal racialized power dynamics. That's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about that because academic language has baked into it power, right? It's not neutral. It is serving some status quo power system. That status quo power system is the dominant white middle class discourse informed by a white racial habitus, or a dominant whitely discourse. That's what I was thinking about when I was thinking about my grading of writing. And I was thinking about this body of research about how in writing in particular, we've got studies that show us that more than half of grades for writing are based in unique, idiosyncratic reader preferences. Many of those preferences can be racially situated. So these are the things I was considering as I was thinking through the ungrading process. We uncritically promote, often out of necessity, a dominant academic discourse that is associated with a local, standardized, edited American English. While these discourses and sets of linguistic conventions are not bad in and of themselves, they do need interrogating with students as structuring structures that give us certain tastes in language and thought. I was thinking about these tastes in language and thought when I was reflecting back on a book that I read back at the turn of the century. Dr. Annette Lareau, Unequal Childhoods. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that book, but the premise of the book, based in her research, she's a sociologist, was that students who children who were raised in middle-class households brought with them into the educational system academic skills that were built into their upbringing through what she calls concerted cultivation, right? Concerted cultivation, that middle-class parents do something different with their kids. And the difference, and she's not saying that one thing is good or bad or better or worse, but the difference is between this concerted cultivation and the accomplishment of natural growth in families that were in a different part of the SES continuum. Families of lower SES would cultivate this organic growth, natural growth in their children, where it was less structured, where there was more time for kids to build connections with other people, where they weren't running from soccer to karate to this to that, where their patterns of thinking and language develop differently. Again, not better and not worse, just different. But that what we expect in the academy was really rooted in that middle class kind of upbringing, right? Where the expectations for thinking and language were bound to that kind of upbringing. And so think about these things I'm showing on the screen right now. For those of you who are listening, I have a salad, a chocolate cake, and a sandwich. And when we ask children to group these things together, group them together by similarity, right? Put them in two groups. Put the similar things together. One of the things that Leroux says is that students from middle class backgrounds recognize that as an academic task. They see that as an academic task. And so they put together the salad and the sandwich, because dessert is something different. That goes into a different category. But a student could also put these together and say, well, the salad and the cake go together because my family eats those things on the weekend. We eat sandwiches during the week. That's my lunch. The sandwich is my lunch. But on the weekend, we have a bigger dinner. We have a bigger meal, and we eat the salad and the cake. So these things got me thinking, had me thinking, and made me think a whole lot about who is served in higher education and whose thinking patterns, whose language patterns are prioritized in higher education. It got me thinking a whole lot about power, right? About how power weaves its way through what we do, not just in higher education as a whole system, but even down to the work that I did and do in my own classroom. For whom are our learning spaces built? That was my question. For whom are our learning spaces built? And how am I complicit in sustaining the vision, the original vision of higher education for whom these spaces are built? So I started the interrogations, right? And I started thinking about the baked in things. I started thinking about the broader culture, our individualism, our hierarchy, our competition features of the broader culture that are baked into higher education as they are baked into all of the social institutions in the country. I started thinking about the idea of power with versus power over. It takes us back to Mary Parker Follett, for those of you who are familiar, the mother of modern management, and thinking about empowerment in the classroom, right? And my role in empowering students to learn and empowering them in their educational processes. I started thinking about the language we use to talk about students and to talk about grading and to talk about writing. Alfie Kohn here says an emphasis on defective mindsets or a tendency to accuse students of being insufficiently motivated conveniently lets us off the hook, right? I started thinking about my role in student learning and motivation. And I took a deep dive into curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and control. What am I really trying to do in the classroom? So part of where I came out here in my process is to a couple of ideas about grading and ungrading. Ungrading is not as simple as just not grading. For me, it's a whole framework around power and around empowerment. It is not as simple as saying, I will not put a number on your writing anymore. That is not, that is not it. It requires a fundamental rethinking of the purpose of education. It requires interrogating power and a willingness to share power. It requires some philosophical undergirding, right? It requires that we work through and articulate the philosophical matters, the things that drive our decision making in the classroom. And it requires time, space, and reflection. So you already see some of the problems here. So how did I do it? My process. Well, I started by embracing my inner radical. I told you earlier that I've been doing a lot of work in higher education, really as a subversive. I tackled some of these issues quietly and individually. And higher education is a very conservative place as a system, right? It doesn't like to change. It does not necessarily embrace progressive ideas. And so knowing that, I had to operate within the system while also working to change some things. And what I chose to change was my own praxis, required reading, research, and reflection, as you know. And this has been a long, long process for me. Again, I have been teaching since the 1900s, as my 19-year-old likes to say. I had to dig through the philosophical formulation. What do I believe about the nature of people, for example? There are some ontological issues at play here. What do I believe about the nature of learning? I had to carefully consider curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and power in the context of what I believe about people and what I believe about learning and what the evidence shows me about people and about learning. And then I had to work through my own assessment of the alignment of philosophy and practice. Is my philosophy apparent in all things? So when we say, for example, this is a very easy test. When we say, I, individual instructor, I empower my students to learn. I, individual instructor, create a caring, nurturing learning experience for my students. My first question is, may I see your syllabus? Because I want to know if the language on your syllabus, for example, does that. If we create through the use of our language, through the use of discursive practices, through the use of the selection of our materials, if we convey those things on the syllabus. So I'm thinking about the entire scope of practice for me, right? And I'll tell you, I'm going to talk about some of the limitations here before the end of this presentation. So some of you are going to be saying to yourselves, well, I don't have the time for all that, right? Because higher education really is not set up to necessarily support or promote these kinds of critical endeavors. And it's not set up to promote the sort of things that I even do as an individual, right? So my praxis, my philosophy of education is such that it begins before students even step foot into my classroom. I call every student on my roster before class starts. I teach a 101 level class, and I want to make sure that students know about the bookstore, not for my class because I'm an OER kind of person, but do you have questions about this institution? Higher education is a foreign landscape to you in many ways. Are there things that I can help you with? Do you have concerns about coming into English 101? Talk to me about your writing history. What are the things that I can do to help ease your path into English 101 so that by the time they even get into the classroom, they already are feeling like this is going to be something different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how it works for me, how ungrading works in English 101, because very often this is where we get tripped up in something like ungrading. What are the practical matters that I need to contend with in English 101 or whatever class I'm teaching? So for me, it works like this. Writers earn a 1 or a 0 on all assignments. You either did the job or you didn't. You did the job to minimum standards or you didn't. And the feedback that I provide for students in their writing is based on the priorities of the particular assignment. The reason I take this approach, the 1 or 0, is that for me, writing is a process, not a product, right? I am looking at your process, not just your product. Most students, in my experience, meet objectives the first time out. And writers who don't, if they earn a 0, for some reason. They rewrite and submit a reflection on those revisions because I want to know not just what you did in response to my feedback, but I also want to know how you did it and the meaning you made out of it. Writers report feeling more engaged, less focused on error, more willing to think deeply, highly engaged in the feedback loop. Writers provide responses to feedback throughout the course, right? So that they are getting feedback from me and from others in the course. We work to create a community of writers, and students get feedback not just from me, but from their fellow writers as well. It's an ongoing dialogue, and every main assignment includes a conference. So this is an opportunity for me to share with students where I think they are in their progress as a writer. And that also saves us from any surprises at the end of the course with regard to the submission of that final grade. And how we get to the final grade, because remember my disingenuous premise here. I am not really vacating grades altogether. Students still need to get a final grade. So in the final exam, students will engage in a metacognitive exercise in which they advance an argument for their grade based on an established set of parameters and the achievement of course outcomes. Well, here I am still controlling the framework for this, right? This is not just my throwing everything away and saying, give yourself a grade for whatever you want. That's not how it works. I still engaged some control over the process, which again, maybe a little disingenuous in my conversation about power and ungrading, but at the end of it, I am responsible for this process, right? So I do have authority and responsibility in the process, and I need to ensure fidelity there. And here's how I do that. So I included in this slide deck my actual final exam, and I am going to read it for the sake of the people who are just listening, because this is, again, one of those practical matters that can be challenging for people as they're thinking through, how would I even make this happen? So in a writing class, honestly, that's one of my privileges is teaching writing, because it's pretty seamless to make this happen in a writing class. So the final paper in English 101 brings together strands of conversation, and you'll be advancing an argument based on evidence from our course. The evidence in this case is your own writing. As part of the ungrading framework in this class, you'll advance an argument about your development as a writer. In the document, you'll address each of the outcomes in the course and demonstrate how well you've met them using evidence from your own writing. Ultimately, your goal is to assess your own performance and render a judgment about your final grade in the course. In addition to using evidence of your own writing from within the course, the document you craft here will also serve as evidence. For example, when you're writing about your abilities to create well-supported, unified, coherent paragraphs, you should also be writing well-supported, unified, coherent paragraphs in this piece. How meta is that? Ultimately, you're advancing an argument and evidence in support of your final grade. By the end of the piece, I should know how you grade your own performance. The metrics we'll use, here's the key, the metrics we'll use to help determine your final grade include the following. And these are on the syllabus. I have it laid out for each grade level. If you expect you're going to achieve an A in English 101, that means that all assignments are a 1 by the last date of the course or a time that you and I have agreed to individually, with the exception of the final exam, obviously. The writer participated in all writer group conferences by the listed due date. The writer has met each of the course outcomes listed later in this document with a high level of proficiency, as demonstrated in the writer's work for the course. In other words, an A in English 101 means meets objectives with consistently high or exceptional quality. So I use this exercise as a means to get students thinking about their performance in class and measuring their own work in class. Throughout the course, again, students are submitting writing and are receiving assessments and feedback. They have to achieve a 1 on everything if they want to earn an A. So here's some caveats. This works for me because I have structural support to allow for risk taking. I am a full-time employee. I don't yet have tenure, but hope to. And I've got really sort of progressive deans in my area who have tolerance for risk taking, right? And so this is not a risky endeavor for me. I can do progressive things and I can try things and I can experiment without the fear of punishment. I had the benefit of the time to think it through. I've been in higher education a very long time and have had secure employment for that entire time period, fortunately. So I had the benefit of the time to think it through. My authority in the classroom is never questioned. So this is role congruity theory, right? Eagley and Carew. When students come into the English classroom, they expect to see somebody like me. They do not have any cognitive dissonance as a result of how their culture trained them to see English teacher, right? We are largely white women. But if you are a Black woman teaching astrophysics or something of that nature, there is an element of potential cognitive dissonance in light of how students have been socialized around science, how they have been acculturated to see what it means to be a scientist. And so I think that puts people at risk when they're embracing progressive pedagogies that may be out of alignment with what students have experienced in their previous education. So I encourage people to think carefully about their circumstances, their individual and institutional circumstances before taking on something like ungrading. Requires significant trust and community building. Honestly, students are often wary. They assume that I'm going to trick them. Where could they have gotten that idea before? I don't know. Maybe they've had poor experiences in their K-12 education or in other places before they get to me. And the philosophical underpinnings of this kind of education require some research and interrogation. If you're not already there, again, if you haven't done that kind of interrogation or that kind of work, then it's going to take a little bit of time to do that. And I want to say that that's not a criticism. Again, we are not really set up for engaging in this kind of interrogation, this kind of critical examination of what we do. So those are a couple of the caveats. And as I said, we're not set up for it. So there's that. It is easier in a lot of ways to not do this. It's easier to continue to perpetuate the systems that have already been built for us, the ones that we have grown up in. So we are not exactly primed for this kind of work. So maybe you shouldn't do it. I'm going to give you the reasons you should not do this. If it requires significant unpaid labor, I cannot support the idea of people who are teaching at multiple institutions, who are precariously employed, who will invest a whole lot into this process as an unpaid laborer. I can't support that idea. If you have institutional support for doing this kind of work, do it. If you believe that people are not capable of self-assessment, if you don't think that students have enough if you don't think they have enough agency or authority or power to engage in self-assessment, I don't think it would be a good fit for you. You can think through those things, but it may not be a good fit. If you have not interrogated sort of the paternalism that underpin both our culture and our current educational system, you want to take some time to do that as you start building your vocabulary around power. Sarah notes in the chat that grading feels like unpaid labor though too. Yeah, it's one of the great byproducts for me of making this choice, by the way. When I get to what has happened for me, I'll share more about that. If you are someone who has a sort of natural inclination around ensuring that people don't cheat the system, and if you assume that they will, it's probably not a good fit for you. Because this is a high trust environment, right? My classroom is a high trust environment. And if it will make you uncomfortable to give students some power, authority, flexibility, freedom, it may not work for you, and that's okay. If you don't already have a history of establishing good relationships with students, right? Because remember, this is a whole package. This is an entire philosophy. This is not just, I'm not going to grade work anymore. This is an entire thing. So think about doing it if you are comfortable with ambiguity, complexity, and nuance. This is not something that's portable, that I can give you a set of things to dump into your existing classroom. That's not how it works. But if you're comfortable working through that process and you're comfortable with not having clarity, on every single thing, then this could be something that would work for you. I think when I make that point, I think about a researcher, Dr. Dana Young at the University of Delaware. I don't know if anybody has read a book she wrote called Irony and Outrage, but she basically advances the idea that people's psychological makeup in some areas are linked to things like their need for closure, right? Or their threat assessment, and that some people have a higher need for closure and clarity and a higher threat assessment of just life in general, and some people don't, right? And I think in my mind I visualize that as sort of a maybe hotter amygdala and a cooler amygdala. And if you are someone who needs clarity, structure, closure on everything, ungrading might not be a great fit, because there are elements of nuance and complexity and gray area that we really need to sort through. And students too, by the way, we have students who have high need for closure, high need for clarity and structure. It can be a challenge for them. If you believe in empowering students to learn, we all say we do. Do we do that? It's a great empirical question. If you can think creatively about assessment in your own class, right? If you're not wedded to a particular way of assessing student learning, if you're in a supportive and secure environment where innovation, risk, and failure are tolerated, I cannot express that more strongly. If you're in an environment that's conducive to this kind of thing, that really matters. And if you're ready to spend less time doing what doesn't matter and more time doing what matters, and to me, that means focusing on feedback and not so much focusing on grading. Ungrading need not be an all or nothing kind of thing. We can implement elements of ungrading into our classes in any discipline. It's flexible enough for a variety of disciplines. And something else that I can't see on this slide, but I'm sure it's brilliant. So I'm working with faculty at my own institution, a math faculty member who wanted to explore ungrading. And I think people can find ways to make that work. And I know that they have, because people out there in the great wide world have done it. So what have my experiences been? What are my results here? Well, students have engaged in more risk-taking as writers, skilled writers especially. So for you writing faculty here, students who come into your classroom with that high cultural capital behind them, right? They already know how to navigate the bureaucracy. They know how to work a system. They have the capital behind them. They tend, in my experience, to be very formulaic writers, right? Because they figured it out. They know what works for writing in education. But when I take the grading piece away, they engage in more risk-taking. All students benefit from the removal of the grade metric in the writing process, but highly skilled writers especially benefit, and students on the lower end also especially benefit from that. Everyone improves, and I've gotten such better writing from students since I've started this process than ever before. So all writers improve, but especially at each end of the continuum, there's some significant growth there. They've developed higher level skills. They report less anxiety and more engagement in the work that they're doing. They report feeling that this is the most I've ever learned about writing. And they report feeling, this is the first time I felt anyone ever cared about my learning. I get a lot of heartbreaking feedback in my course evaluations, and a lot of it is about that. Like, no one has ever really cared about me as an individual in the classroom before. Again, I don't blame individual people for that. That's a systems problem, right? Do we cultivate that sort of thing? Do we cultivate the care, compassion, connection, and community that good learning requires? And for me personally, as a result of ungrading, I spend way less time worrying about my feedback, whether or not this feedback justifies a particular grade, gyrating over the difference between an 87 and an 84. It's nonsense, and it has no place in my brain anymore. I've focused on the quality of my feedback, narrowed the scope of my feedback, spent less time in the whole process. Like other people at the end of the semester, they got their big stack of term papers that they're trying to get through and grade. I have really low stress grading because, again, I have focused on feedback and have built relationships with students over the semester in a way that makes my grading process much, much smoother. And we've enhanced our writer-to-writer bonds in the classroom. I feel like I've always done that, but ungrading has really enhanced that relationship. It's sort of moved me out of the umpire role and into the coach role, which is much, much better for me and my teaching style. And I think it's better for student learning. There's a book here, Ungrading, that I recommend you take a look at. The editor is Susan Bloom, and you can grab it in electronic format pretty easily. I left a note there in case I didn't say it already. Ungrading does not mean all or nothing. There are ways to do it in a sort of incremental approach if you would like. Now, I know we've got some questions in the Q&A, and so I'm going to flip over to that. But Judith, if you have anything that you want to highlight here, I will turn it over to you there for a minute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. I will actually read you the questions from the Q&A. And the first one is from James. Are there good references and models on how to do ungrading in STEM? And I know you referenced this in your presentation. I don't doubt the usefulness of this for English 101, but I don't see how to map this into my CS math courses.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And the answer is yes, I'm sure there are. And I'll put my email in the chat. If you reach out to me, I will connect you with some people that you can talk to about that.
I'm also going to give a +1 for the ungrading book here. There are several chapters that refer to case studies related to STEM as well as math. And that can be helpful here too, as well as contract specifications grading, which I know a lot of math faculty engage in.
Yeah, remember, there are lots of different models for ungrading. This is mine. Lots of people use labor-based grading, contract grading, all of those other sorts of models that are great fits for them.
I have another question for you here. My challenge with asking students to revise and reflect on an assignment if they get a 0 is that it butts up against the next assignment, which can mean students fall behind on the course and the coursework piles up as they're working on the new assignment while still finishing the last assignment. How do you manage that?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, those are outliers in my own class. Most writers meet objectives first time out. But also, again, for me, it's a whole package. This is also about course design and how I have my assignments designed so that even if you're still working on, let's say, big assignment number one feeds into assignment number 2. So as you're going back to revise assignment number 1, you are simultaneously working on assignment 2, but they are connected, right? They're connected in an intuitive way so that students actually in the revision process, I think they get a better sense of how those things are connected. And I have not found that students struggle with that, with getting those assignments finished. They work on them simultaneously. There are usually very specific things that they need to do in their revisions that they can handle pretty swiftly. So I have to say that for me personally, I just have not run into the problem of students getting jammed up at the end. Now, I've had students get jammed up because of the pandemic, right? And then I sort of flex my institutional tools like an incomplete grade so that they can get through. But most of the time, the majority of the time, students are not in that situation.
Do you give the students the assignments for the final ahead of time?
Yeah, I do. Actually, everything. All my assignments are available all the time, start to finish. And this is a whole package, right? It's also about course design. So I talk through how all of our assignments relate to one another, the trajectory and flow of our writing throughout the course. I teach English 101 through the lens of conspiracy theory because I think information literacy is the most critical skill for me to teach students. And so our assignments all work together. And so, yes, they are available from day one, right? It's another privilege of being a full-timer is that I spent a lot of time on course design and the course design and the assignment design facilitate my ability to engage in ungrading.
Another question, what's the Venn diagram relationship of ungrading versus specifications grading? I'll give another +1 for the ungrading book because there is a chapter on specifications contract grading in there.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. I would say check that out. I think that will give you a pretty good background.
Well,
Go ahead, Judith.
oh, I was just going to ask, another question we received is, will the slides be available? But I didn't mean to cut off your response.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll send them to you, Judith. And if you would like to send them to anyone, that's fine.
Sure.
Or post them on your website or whatever. I have them listed as Creative Commons. So, it doesn't matter to me if anyone would like to use them. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Judith, do you mind if I jump over to those?
Sure, please do.
So Gay says, I'm a department chair trying to discuss equity grading with my colleagues. There are a few faculty who are adamantly opposed to these ideas and a few who are on board. Any suggestions for moving the needle for those who are entrenched? I don't bother with them. I'm going to be honest. I'm not trying to pull people out of a trench. Honestly, I go to the willing, right? Because any system is going to have your cave people, colleagues against virtually everything. So I just don't bother because I don't have the energy for that. I am a relic of higher education. I do not have the energy for that. So I go with the willing. And to me, that's how we get traction and cultural change, right? I start with the willing, the people who are willing to step forward and say, I'm going to support you every step of the way in this process. And then you're going to have amazing results and you are going to be an evangelical for this process. I don't even have to do anything at that point, right? So that's really my sort of, again, subversive cultural change approach. I think reading with people is helpful. I think, getting people to talk about these things. I like to ask questions, right? Like, tell me what you are really trying to do here. Tell me about your philosophy of education. There are people who just will not move on something like this. And again, that's okay. I am not backing up the Jeep with the chain and trying to pull them out of that trench. I'm just not here for that.
Although that is quite a visual. To see that.
Right. It's on my mind because, the reason I had to teach my son how to drive a stick is that he has a Jeep that was a 20-year-old Jeep that was gifted to him from his grandfather. It was stick. So he had to learn how to drive it. Even when we went to pick it up, he couldn't even drive it. I had to drive it home because he didn't know how to do it. So, yeah. If you are, working in a system where you've got people who are already there or close to being there, get on them, take care of them, work with them, support them, give them whatever kind of visible support you can give them, and let them take it from there.
We have one item here in the Q&A that I just wanted to note. I'd also love to know whether there is literature on this topic that I could use to convince conservative colleagues that I'm not just lacking rigor, I'm coming up for tenure soon, and while I have some support, I'd like to cultivate more. And I will say that we will put when we post the video of the session, we will put some literature links for more information with the video. So that way you can look through those articles and see what could help you build your case for tenure.
Absolutely. And I saw someone in the chat mention David Buck. Thank you. There is a reading group going on. I think it's on Saturday mornings, led by David Buck. And he also has an open access collection of materials. And if I can find it quickly, I will put it in chat. And if not, I'll send it to Judith and she can put it into
That's great.
Your materials. And I cannot recommend Twitter enough for connecting with other like-minded colleagues. So if you're not on Twitter, you might want to join just for the sake of this. It really is a great way to connect. I am on Twitter. I'm at Christine Noack. I put that in the chat. You should feel free to connect with me as well. I have a locked account, but I'm happy to have you connected with me. I'm going to look for that David Buck book quickly here. If anybody else finds it, please feel free to put it in chat. In fact, I think these very slides are part of that collection or some incarnation of these slides.
There was another question or comment. One of the things that I tell faculty is to avoid high stakes assessments, yet if their whole grade relies only on their final assessment, isn't that putting a great deal of pressure onto that one final assessment?
Heck yes. And I say, why would we use the final assessment for the whole grade, right? So in my case, students are advancing an argument for their grade, but remember those parameters, right? They must have gotten competency on all of the assignments up to that point to earn an A. And then I have a similar parameters set for each grade level. I think it's never a good idea to use one final assessment as the entire basis for measuring learning and assigning a grade. So in my case, although it seems like the final exam is the thing, it's really not the whole thing. It's just an articulation of the entire process from start to finish, right? All of the writing that we have done over the course of the semester, coupled with the feedback they've gotten from me, both in writing and in conference.
I see there's a comment here in chat from Linda about your digital literacy and conspiracy theories. We want to do more on this at Temple and fighting disinformation, misinformation. I think this would be a really popular webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to share any materials. It is so fun to teach information literacy through conspiracy theory. It has been great. And at the end of the course that I'm teaching right now, I revised a couple of things in the course so that by the end, students are actually going to be creating a product to educate their fellow college students about conspiracy theory, misinformation, information literacy. So I've moved them toward writing for a very specific audience and creating a product that would be informative for their fellow college students. So yeah, it's been a really great ride for the past 4 or 5 years that I've been using conspiracy theory as a basis.
I have 2 more questions for you, Christine.
Mm-hmm.
Are there useful resources for ungrading in very large classes, 200 or more students?
It's a great question. And I think there is something in the ungrading book. I don't remember explicitly about using ungrading for larger classes. So that would be a good resource to check. And if you email me, I will also dig around and see if I can find some specific things or some specific people. I have not thought it through myself because I, again, have the luxury of teaching writing, so 23 or fewer.
Yeah, I feel that the conferencing piece is where it would get really tough with those large classes. What is your typical grade distribution at the end of the course?
Yeah, so, people might think with ungrading, oh, everybody gets an A, right? Which honestly, for me, is fine if that happens. Isn't that what I want? Don't I want writers to complete the course with a high level of proficiency and competency in those course outcomes? But I have, I think, sort of a little bit of an inverse curve there. I do have a good number of A's in part. I'm going to tell you what, remember, I'm an expert teacher. I teach my students well. I know what I'm doing and I know how to get good writing out of them. So I have a good number of A's, handful of B's, and then some students in the C level. And, very often, very few students get a D or an F in English 101. I mean, again, I'm doing this at community college. We've got lots of built-in support and structures for them. We've got opportunities for them if things get challenging and they can't complete a class, right? We are active in helping them make good decisions. Students who earn C's in English 101, usually they're the ones advancing for their grade as a C. And I say, yeah, you know what? You're right. You met the competency. You did the job. You can do these things. You weren't setting the world on fire as you were doing them. And that's okay because you are sort of a novice in this environment. And so, it's okay if you were not getting an A. Yeah, I provided a metric for A. How do they define themselves as a B or a C? I have metrics laid out for every grade. I just didn't include them on that slide, but there are metrics for every grade. So it sort of goes down if you did 80% of these things. Every major writing assignment needs to have a 1, but if you did 80% of the minor assignments at a 1, if you did 80% of the writers' conferences on time, et cetera, et cetera. What do I do if I disagree with a student's self-assessment? I'll say that happened one time. And in that case, we had a conversation about it. And ultimately, she agreed with the evidence that I presented in the final grade. So generally, there are no surprises because we have gone
accidentally stepped on it. I accidentally stepped on it.
I lost my stream here. Oh no.
Hi, sorry.
I thought it was me. I thought I froze.
I can't turn my video back on, but my final thought there was just that we've worked through the process together, and so there are no surprises by the end. And sorry, I'm in a system that's getting an upgrade between 11 and 2 today, so I'm glad we at least made it through the entire presentation before that.
Yeah, no, this was great, and thank you so much on behalf of the Online Learning Toolkit team and Christine. We thank you so much for being here and participating. Your engagement was wonderful. I will be sending out a recording of this session to everyone who registered today, and we will have additional resources and notes, as well as a link to the slides from Christine. Christine, thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith, and thanks everyone. Please reach out to me if I can be helpful to you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now.